Hi there, my name is Rustybot. I'm going to show you how to make your own multi-tool. This will let you have multiple functionalities such as developer and protoflux without having to swap back and forth. First, we're just going to speed through setting up the basic hierarchy. So I'm going to create a new empty object. I'm going to rename that to Multitool Demo. I'm going to make a child under here, and I'm going to call it Tools. And I'm going to make another one called Visuals. So the way a multi-tool is going to work is we have a base equipable component on the root slot here. So attach component, tools, go down to tool multiplexer. There we go. This allows us to equip the whole object as one tool. And it has a list of tools that it can swap to using this active tool index. So if this number is 0, then it'll be on tool 0. If this number is 1, it'll be on tool 1, etc. For now, we're just going to use developer and Flux, and we're going to be able to swap back and forth between those. So now under tools, I'm going to make another child and then rename that to dev. And we're going to add the dev tool component. So now there is just a dev tool sitting inside this hierarchy. If I open this dropdown, it's got a left and right grip pose. It's got a visual. We're going to get rid of these two grip poses because the multi-tool uses its own. We're going to move the visual into the dedicated slot we made for it and then rename it dev visual to not get confused with the eventual Flux one. But notice how the dev tool component has tip references and everything required to be able to equip it. So we're going to grab this component, go to our demo root object, and drop that as the first item in the list. So now our multi-tool will be able to swap between nothing and dev tool mode. If we equip this currently, this is already a functional developer tool. I can select the inspector, whatever I want to do. But we can't swap modes yet. Right now, if I set this to 1, that had to be done manually, and there's nothing there. So there's no extra options in my context menu. But what we can do is go to Tools, make a new child, call that Flux, and we're going to add the protoflux tool component. Now this one also comes with object root and grabbable, and it comes with some grip poses and references. We're going to get rid of the grip poses. We're going to put the label under the visual, move the visual into the dedicated slot, and then rename that into Flux visual. There we go. And we're also going to go back to these tools and just delete object root and grabbable off of them, since we're simply using these slots to store the tool component. Now grab the protoflux tool component and put that in the tool multiplexer. Technically speaking, this is now a multi-tool. Obviously, at the moment, it's a pretty terrible multi-tool, but we still have a little bit more setup to do before we can get it actually swapping back and forth. First things first is I'm going to go to Visuals, and we're going to use a Boolean switcher component to stop this from happening. Right now, we have two cones here that are overlapping. We've got the dev visual, which is the red cone, and we've got the flux visual, which is the purple. So I'm going to go to Visuals. We're going to go back out here to Transform Drivers. We're going to add the Boolean switcher component, and we're going to hit Auto Add Children. So that'll populate it with the dev and flux visual slots there, and you'll notice flux is already turned off. So what this component does is similar to the active tool index, where it has an active index, and since this is 0 right now, the active state on the dev visual slot is true, and all of the other elements of this list are false. Right now, it's just the 2 on the list, but if you want to expand your multi-tool, this is really nice to have. So if I clear this component, or gizmo rather, and we look at the red cone there being the dev visual, but then I set this to 1, now it's the flux visual. So since we want this to directly correspond with which tool is active, we can just go to Multitool Demo, grab the active tool index field, go back over to Visuals, and drop that on the active index for the switcher, then hit Drive. So now we're just value copying the tool index to the switcher. And since this is in flux mode, we have the flux visual. But if we go back to Multitool Demo and set this to 0, it goes back to dev. Next, we're going to go to the dev tool component over here, and we're going to undrive this material. The reason being we need to modify it, and right now it's an overlay material. So notice how it appears sort of over top of my hand, even when my hand is in front of it. So we're going to go to dev visual. We're going to change this material to 0 on the behind colors. You don't necessarily have to do that, but I find it's nicer when it doesn't show up over top of things. Finally, we're going to go to Multitool Demo, make a new child, and call that scripts, because we need a place to put our protoflux when we go into swapping modes. So what I'd like to happen is to have the tool swap modes when you double-click context menu. So if I go tick tick, then it'll go to dev mode. If I go tick tick, then it'll go back to Flux mode. So I'm going to open my node browser. I'm going to go into devices. We're going to go to controllers and get the standard controller. So this lets us get the menu input, that's context menu, where if I do this and press my context button, then it's true. When I let go, it's false. We're going to be using that output. I also need to get a user, right? I can't just plug it into myself manually every time. So we're going to go back. We're going to go to users, get active user self, plug that in here. Whatever user's hierarchy this node is under is what it'll output. So this will always be the wielder of the tool. We're going to go back to tools, and we're going to get tool chirality, tool equipping side. There we go. So this way, it'll be whichever hand you're holding the tool in. So if I have the tool equipped on my right and I double click my right menu, then it'll activate, but not if I do it for my left. So plug that into controller, pull out a tool input, and this just takes the tool component, which we can get from our main slot. Right, whoops. Our main slot, there we go. So now the wielder of this tool, on the side they're holding it on, pressing the menu should do something. So that means we need to fire an event. I'm going to go to flow. I'm going to get a fire on true. When the menu is pressed, according to that user, make a new pulse context. So at the moment, this just fires every time the wielder of the tool presses their menu. What we want is to somehow have the first pulse get caught and open the door for a second pulse to go through. So for that, I'm going to get an if, I'm going to get a data model Boolean toggle, Boolean latch, and I'm going to get a delay. We'll use seconds float. And finally, I'm going to get an async, start async task. Okay, so I'll go over this as best I can, but it is a little bit of a funky circuit. We're going to start by making an async task. That's pretty standard. This allows us to have a pulse context that takes time, that takes longer than one calculation. Now we're going to use the Boolean latch as our gate controller, the if as our gate, and the delay for how long we want to hold it open, which in this case, I prefer doing something like 0.3. So essentially what we're going to have is this be our main output. This is our main input. So I'll just put a call at the start of this async task, like so. The if is going to be controlled by the Boolean latch. So that's like this. And what's going to happen initially is, since this is false, the first pulse will come out the bottom output of the if. This, we want to open the gate. So the first pulse gets diverted to holding this to true. The second pulse then can get sent through, but we need the gate to reset after a certain amount of time. So when this gets set to true, we pulse the delay, wait for 0.3 seconds, and then set this to false. Now, when I double click this, click, click, it goes through. If I just click it once, notice how it sets to true for 0.3 seconds. If I double click it again, double click, this is how we get our double impulse. This is a little bit of a mess. Something I sometimes like to do for a circuit like this is just spin that around, makes it a little bit easier to follow. Obviously, you lose the label, but if you know how that node works, then you should be fine. What you can also do is put a local impulse timeout at the end here, because currently if I UIX spam this, it'll just keep going through. The gate will be held open for 0.3 seconds, and during that time, any amount of pulses can come out here. So if we want to do that, I'm going to go back to regular flow, local impulse timeout, seconds. And here we can put a timeout with a time of 0.3. So now if I spam it, we just get one every 0.3. Up to you how you want your tool to work. So now we have an output whenever we double press, and we need to have that actually affect what tool mode we're using. So to start, I'm going to go to Multitool Demo, and we're going to grab the active tool index and then use context to pull that out as a source. So this lets us interact with it using protoflux. I'm going to go to Actions and get a write, value write of whatever kind, bring that here. We plug the source into the variable, and that allows the write to directly interface with that, even though it's a component. So just for demonstration here, I'm going to set this to something like 2, bring a pulse here. And now if we look at our active tool index and I click this, it gets set to 2. So we're going to do a little bit of math for the input of this so that it can swap back and forth. We're going to go back out to operators, go all the way down, get a value inc, which is short for increment, and get a value mod, which is short for modulus. These are two operations that allow you to increment a number. So for example, this is 2 plus 1 is 3. Pretty straightforward. Modulus, however, is a little bit more. So if we have something like this and I set the mod to 5, what this is going to do is divide this number by this number and output the remainder. So if I put out something like 25, there's no remainder. If I put something like 24, we get 4 because it can remove 4 5s, 20, and then just leaves us with the 4. So what we're going to do is set the mod to 2, to our number of tools, and then we're going to have the increment go in there, and then the output go into our right. So what's happening here is we're saying, okay, go to the next tool, plus 1, but if we're already at our final tool, then it'll wrap around and go back to our first tool. So since this is 2, it's outside the list, that doesn't really work. But what we can do is hit call, and now the current tool is 1, and the next tool is going to be 0, because it goes back from Flux to dev. If I click this, the current tool is 0, that is dev, and the next tool, plus 1, is 1, that's Flux. So now all we have to do is get rid of these displays, this call, and plug the impulse timeout into the right. Now if I go to scripts, make a new child, call this, call that tool swapping, grab this, pack the circuit into there, unequip that real quick. If I equip this and double press context, we swap over. I'm now in Flux mode. I can cut wire, I can open my browse nodes, I can double hit context, and now I'm in developer mode. I can open an inspector. Now before we get into animation and sound, we need to add one more thing to the protoflux part of the tool, the label. When you have a node selected, it'll tell you what node you have, and when you hover over something, it'll tell you what value type. Sometimes, depending on the tool, even with a nice little color attached to it. So what we're going to do is go into my public folder, go to Welcome to Resonite Tutorial Objects, go to Project Kits, and then I already have a little protoflux label formatter circuit set up in this bitbot here. Just grab it and press trigger to open, and here we go. We've got some string formatting stuff going on here, and then a bunch of inputs. I'll go over this in a supported video attached, released with this one. So what I'm going to do next is just place that, minimize this, and kill him. Go to the Flux tool in the Multitool, and we're going to grab a whole bunch of these fields as sources and use those as our inputs. So we're going to get spawn node type, we're going to get hovering element color, content type, and name. And then we're going to go to our Flux visual label, text, and drive that. Now, bring all these down here, put the text drive over there, and we're going to get these all sorted. So the hovering element name is the name of whatever we are hovering over. I'm going to equip this real quick and double click to switch to Flux mode. We're going to drive the text, and now if I'm hovering over something like that, we can see this is on true, on false. It'll tell you what the function of that input or output is. So we're going to plug that into is null and into the format. And now we can see when I hover over this, we get a little bit on the label. I'm going to put spawn node type down here, hovering element content type there, and color here. So content type goes in there. And now when I hover over, it'll tell me what content type it is. String, bool, type. Color can go in here, and now it's colored according to what that data type is. And spawn node type goes in there, and that's the final one. So now if I press secondary on this to select that, is null string is the node that I spawn out when I double click. And everything else gets formatted accordingly. Next, we're just going to make a new slot under scripts. Call that Flux label. And pack this circuit in there. Now we're going to give it a little animation when we swap tools, because nobody wants just a pop-pop back and forth. So I'm going to unpack tool swapping. We're going to go to async in Flow. We're going to get an async sequence, which is, again, what I like to use when I'm animating. So we're going to move the right over and actually disconnect that for now. I'm going to put the async sequence here. And the reason for this is I want the tool to swap after a little bit of an animation has changed. Since this is directly hooked up to our Boolean switcher, if we animate this cone, it's not going to matter because it'll turn off right away. So this way I can have a little animation happen and then have the tool swap and then have another little animation happen. And I'm going to actually add a fourth one here so that we have room for a sound effect. And we're going to start with that. So I'll go back to audio, play one shot, pop one of these out. And I like to put my audio around the side, actually. So that's up to personal preference. But since this node is so large, I like to put it back here. We're going to get a clip input and a slot input. The slot is going to be our multi-tool. And the clip is just going to be this silly little recording I made earlier. I'm going to set the volume of that to 0.3, so it's not too loud, just enough for it to matter. Next, we're going to have a second step to our async sequence. This is going to be a tween. We're going to go to actions. We're going to get a tween value for a float. And we're going to plug that in. So what I want to happen is the cone to shrink in height and then pop back out again as the next tool, which means I'm going to need to go to our visuals and modify these two cone meshes that are on both of them. So what that looks like for me is I'm going to go to visuals here, go back to my attached components, go to relations, value multi-driver, float. I'm going to grab this component, click trigger to pull out a little inspector for it, and then I'm going to go to each of these cones and notice that the height is 0.05, so I'll put that here, and I'll add two drives to it, and then I'm going to drive the height of the cone using that multi-driver. Same thing for the Flux visual, since that cone is the same height. And then I'm going to use this value on the multi-driver as my tween target. So that way I can animate both cones at once. Now I'm going to set it to 0, and I'm going to set the duration as 0.2. There we go. So now what happens is we double press menu. It'll activate a sound effect, and it'll animate the cone going to 0 height. Then I want it to change the tool index, and then I want it to animate the cone back up. So I'm going to make another tween. I'm going to use the same duration. I'm going to use the same target, but it's going to come out of this step of the async, and it's going to go to 0.05. So now I can pack this, clear the gizmo, equip my tool, and when I double press context, now this is a super basic animation. So I'm just going to add a little torus mesh as an additional bit. I'm going to unequip the ProtoFlux tool, and from now on, I'm going to be using my own multi-tool. So I'm going to go to Create New, 3D Model, Torus. I'm going to set the major radius down to 0.01, which is the same radius as the bottom of this cone. I'm going to set the minor radius to something like 0.004, and that makes it just like this little thin ring, and that's going to go right on the end there. Maybe I'll set the major radius up to something like 0.15. Yeah, 0.015. Then I'm going to delete grabbable on the torus, and I'm going to take this and move it under visuals. Now, the Boolean switcher has auto add children, so it has automatically turned off the torus. I'm going to get rid of that and then get rid of the torus from that list too. Then manually turn it back on, reset its position rotation scale, but set its X rotation to 90. And now it's lined up roughly with the bottom of those cones. So then we're going to just move it forward by 0.025. And now it's lined up exactly with the bottom of the cone. Next, I'm going to open up tool swapping again. And we're going to add some additional tweens to the torus to have it move with the cone. Because right now, when I double context, the torus just sort of sits there. So I'm going to open a node browser using my new tool. I'm going to go to Actions, Tween Value, and I'm going to get a Float 3 tween. we're going to use the same target for 2 of these, just like last time. And we're going to plug these right into onStarted for the other tweens, since they're animating at the same time. Then we're going to plug the duration into the same thing, like so. And we're going to get an input out for both. Now we want the torus to go forwards to match the cone and then backwards. So since its default resting position is 0.025, that'll be what it goes back to at the end of the animation. So in the Z value here, we're going to go 0.025. And in the Z value up here, this is when it goes forward. We want it to go to 0.05, since that's halfway up the cone. Then we just have to put the position of the torus in there. So that is this field. Drop that like so. And then I'm going to pack this, unequip my own multi-tool, equip this one, and when I double hit context, there we go. Now, as promised, we're going to look at the grip poses. Notice how I have the left grip pose selected here. And if I zero out the position of that slot and then re-equip the tool, it sort of just goes into the middle of my hand. What's happening is the left grip pose acts as an offset from your tool anchor. So since my laser is emitting from here, when I equip the tool, the laser emits from there. But if I take the left grip pose slot and move it off to the right, I can unequip the tool and re-equip it, and now the tool is equally off to the left. So you can use this to position your tool based on your own hand or what's comfortable for you. And the laser doesn't have to necessarily come out where your laser normally would. And there's your multi-tool. Now all you have to do is get comfortable with adding whatever other tools you want. Flux and Dev are great, but for example, I can't live without my material tool or my pen. Those are definitely necessities for me. Figure out what you need. See you next time.